So I was born in Monrovia, Liberia, to that beautiful woman, my mom, and actually my first customer, I would say, because every time I told her that she looked gorgeous, she would pay me 5 cents. So this was among my best businesses, very, very profitable, not too scalable, but still great. And 5 years ago, I would say that I became a social entrepreneur. Before that, I was a social entrepreneur of a different kind. This is me actually drinking vodka straight out of the bottle in my Silicon Valley days, and that was the biggest social aspect of my businesses. But at the age of 29 years old, I heard for the first time the story of the women's peace movement in Liberia. And I'd grown up the son of a African diplomat, with all my father's friends being among, the presidents, the ministers, the ambassadors. And for decades, I'd heard about them talk about this war in a way that only inflicted more and more violence. Every time they talked about creating peace, it was about which new rebel group could we send in to deal with the previous rebel group. And it just blew my mind at the age of 28 years old, when I had essentially written off being Liberian, that a group of women, some of whom were poor, illiterate, started a peace movement where they wore white T-shirts and white headscarves and caused peace in our country for the first time. And then turned that into a political movement and elected the first woman president on the continent of Africa. And I started to think to myself, all the way from Silicon Valley, California, how could I go back and be partners with those women in business? And so I went back to Liberia for the first time in 28 and a half years. I started going around to all these various women's groups, and I asked them, what kind of business can we actually start? And the common thread I noticed among all of these women's groups was the fact that they all had a sewing program. So I said, well, what if we were able to raise some investment and actually create a sewing factory? And we did. We raised about just under $1 million, brought in machines from some of the best companies in the world, Juki, got some small contracts to get us started, and started what was the first fair trade certified apparel factory in all of Africa. Another thing that makes our factory special is that 49% of the equity is owned by the women that work there. So we just have multiple layers of impact. And we also became the first value-added exporter in Liberia. So 97% of Liberia's exports were raw diamonds, timber, and iron ore. And we were the first person to actually create any value in our country and export it. Then we really hit the jackpot. In 2012, I signed my first agreement with a company called Hager. It would be about $20 million a year in annual business. A couple months later, I signed a second contract with a Japanese trading company called Itochu. It would also be from $18 to $23 million of business. And we just thought that we were going to be this amazing post-conflict success story. In fact, there was literally a line out the door every day that we were hiring, and we were hiring them in droves. It was absolutely perfect. We were hundreds of people into what we knew was hiring thousands of people. And the social impact that we were already seeing was astoundingly amazing. We had on the quantitative side, in a country where 40% of children are in school, 98% of children with a mother who had a job were in school. 100% had access to health care, so malaria was a nuisance but not a threat to their very existence. So to us, we saw this as a really amazing accomplishment, but the biggest accomplishments were in the area like our divorce rate within the factory. About 25% of the women divorced their husbands within the first year. I didn't really understand why, but many of them had been sold into child marriages at the age of 13, 14 years old, and now having this economic independence gave them everything they needed to move out on their own. So we thought we were really rolling. As you can imagine, it took me about 2.5 years to build a new factory, which Spark now shares with us in office in Monrovia. Build a new factory, import millions of dollars of new equipment, train this workforce, get everything going. And 2.5 years into it, I'm in Monrovia. I'm sitting on the factory floor every day, not spending any time in my office in San Francisco or New York. I am in Monrovia with one single thing in mind, getting these Hager orders out the door. these MOUs had turned into purchase orders for the first time. We had about $500,000 in purchase orders that were due at the end of October. And it was August 3rd. And to that point, Ebola had been this thing that was lurking in the background of Monrovia here and there. It was mostly out in the rural areas. And then on August 3rd, they declared a national state of emergency. I'm sure many of you guys remember there was an area in Monrovia that was quarantined. Our factory is at half a block away from that area. 75% of my workforce was now under quarantine. I called the president's office. I said, you guys, you got to help me out here. I've got these orders and they're due, and it's my first $500,000 under these gigantic contracts. They cannot be late. Garment industry is cutthroat. And, what advice can you give me about opening my factory next week? And they said, the only advice we can give you is don't open your factory, period. So as you can imagine, having to go back to my customers and explain to them that we would not be making our orders pretty much meant that there went our business. We, even in November, as the state of emergency was lifted, we could not convince any of our customers to come back to Liberia. I used to go and have meetings everywhere from Amsterdam to New York, and at the end of every meeting I would say, yes, please come visit us in Liberia, come and see the factory, and most people would. Now I'd say the same thing, and most people would just laugh at me and pat me on the head and say, thank you very much. So completely stuck in this situation where I now had hundreds of workers, an investment of about $5.5 million and no customers. I decided that we needed to do something extremely radical. And for us, that meant for the first time bringing our own brand to market. So we created a new clothing brand called Uniform. And the idea behind Uniform, given that Liberia was struggling not only to get people back to work, but also to get kids back in school. And as many of you know, one of the major barriers to kids even attending free public schools in Africa is the cost of the uniform. So we came up with this idea that said this: I had hundreds of thousands of dollars of dead stock material in my factory warehouse that I couldn't do anything with. I couldn't sell it. It'd been sitting in a Liberian warehouse for 8 months. If any of you guys know the smell of Liberia, that product wasn't going anywhere. So I had all of this leftover stock. I had no idea what I could do with it. And I thought, well, what if we could come up with a way to actually help kids get back into school, help their moms get back into work, and do so profitably. And we came up with the idea of Uniform. For every item we sold, we would give away a school uniform to a child who otherwise could not go to school. We launched actually Uniform on Kickstarter because we needed to see if there was a market for it, and quite frankly, our investors had gotten a little bit tired of putting in more and more money given what had just happened with Hager. And we had a ridiculously amazing response. Our goal was to pre-sell $50,000 worth of t-shirts. We sold $50,000 worth of t-shirts in the first 5 hours. We ended up selling $230,000 worth of t-shirts extremely profitably, and I even got a chance to meet Shaquille O'Neal. That would be me on the left, the smaller one, if you couldn't tell, who is wearing a 7X version of our t-shirt, the only one that we made, which is pretty amazing. So a lot of people asked me, Chid, even some of my investors and board members, they said, Chid, we know you worked really hard to build this business. You ran into a situation that no one could have predicted. Everybody would have been okay with you saying, okay, it's okay, we're just going to walk away. Everybody would have been fine. Every investor understood. In fact, I met an old friend here just earlier this afternoon, and the first question was, are you still in business? Because it was just assumed that with everything going on in Liberia, we'd just wrap up and go home. And so people ask me, what was it that made you say, no, we're going to come up with this new idea and pivot? And the answer for me is quite simple. It's actually the answer at the heart of Spark's mission. See, in Liberia, you can see it in these two charts. In Liberia, after the war, GDP actually came roaring back to record levels, about $2 billion. But per capita GDP, the second chart, is about 1/3 of what it was in the 1980s. So the issue in Liberia is not that we can't get the mining companies to come back and the banks to come back. We'll be able to do that. Those guys are hungry for money. But how do we get money into the hands of the people that really need it? And the question for me isn't just a question about impact investing or a better version of aid. This isn't about charity. To me, this is about justice. In the civil rights movement, we always heard the line, "No justice, no peace." And it's almost said as a threat. But I think, like Spark, what I came to understand is that truly and so presently, we need to understand this more as an axiom, that without economic justice, we indeed will never have peace. And I am so committed to peace for the people in my country and the people all around the world. Thank you so much.